Hello, I'm Neil May, aka the Kettlebell Physio, and this is a video of my PhD journey. I started full-time in January of 2018, and the project was officially signed off complete at the end of April this year, 2022. I've put together roughly 150 slides covering the 4-year project, so this is part one of 2 videos due to the file length. I've had to split it. It's unscripted and unedited. You'll notice on occasion between slides there seems to be a little glitch in the recording. That's where I've made some form of cock up on a slide and re-recorded it. So excuse those. Now, the reason I put this together is that here in Australia we don't have a verbal defence of our candidature at the end of a PhD. We simply submit the thesis, it gets sent off for peer review, and then once the comments come back and we make amendments, it's resubmitted and that's it. So there's never an opportunity for us to publicly talk about what we've done and give other people an opportunity to see inside the PhD journey. So I've put this together for those that have primarily been following my journey over the last 4 years. I'm assuming that you know something about the Bell trial because I have been making quite a noise about it on my own page for some time now. So obviously in 4 years I've done quite a lot of work. The focus of this is the Bell trial, which is the centerpiece, but there have been several peripheral studies as well, which have formed the project overall. There are links to the thesis and each of the publications in the comments below. If you have any questions about anything in this and part 2, or the publications or kettlebells more specifically, please feel free to contact me directly. The Facebook page is probably the best point of contact, and I'd love to have a chat. Now, before we get stuck in, I'll just preface this by saying that today is Wednesday the 8th of June, and a couple of hours ago I trained with a group from the Bell trial in a local park. Now we're two years after the trial finished, and due to COVID I had hoped to train with the participants for 9 months and give them a lot more momentum than they ended up having. And again, due to COVID and my commitment to this project, I wasn't able to assist them and train with them and help them in the way that I had hoped. So for that period they have been training together each Wednesday in a local park, completely independent of my input, which was my overall intent of this was to encourage physical activity. So with that in mind, let's get started. This, if you're unfamiliar, is the title of my thesis, Promoting Healthy Aging with Kettlebell Training, a Pragmatic Control Trial and Qualitative Study. So that gives two indications as to the group that I was working with, which were older adults, and what I did with them, which was kettlebell training. Yesterday, when I submitted my data. So the next question is, why kettlebells? I graduated as a physio in 2012. I don't recall how I came across the functional movement systems now. Some of you will be familiar with it. Most commonly is the FMS, which is typically aimed at personal trainers as a screening tool, and then the SFMA, which is aimed more at clinicians in terms of movement diagnosis and treatment and so on. Now, Gray Cook, who is typically regarded as the founder of the FMS, when I say FMS I mean systems encompassing everything, had been through a kettlebell training program called the RKC. Now this gentleman that you're looking at is called Pavel Tsatsouline. He's a Russian who is widely accredited with introducing and popularizing kettlebells in the West, which really started to take off in the early 2000s. Now, Gray Cook had been through the RKC, and as a result of that, a number of kettlebell exercises and the use of kettlebells features very heavily in the FMS and their corrective exercise library. So I signed up to do the FMS at the end of 2012. I went down to Melbourne, and the course was being hosted by somebody who was called an RKC master coach, RKC master. Anyway, very good at kettlebells and highly regarded in using kettlebells. I'd been training in gyms regularly since 1991 at that point, but had never used kettlebells before. And the group was predominantly male, predominantly personal trainers, with lots of people that were familiar with kettlebells. And I was introduced to exercises like the arm bar. I'm not going to try and describe that now, that I couldn't do. And I felt like a fish out of water. I felt very uncomfortable, but there was something about the kettlebells on that weekend and then subsequently that really piqued an interest in me with my physiotherapy hat on. I could see opportunities to use them in a clinical sense or for specific purposes that had never really presented themselves with dumbbells and barbells and the other equipment that I was more used to. And so I jumped on this bandwagon with both feet, and I thought, I don't feel comfortable not knowing how to use this tool, and it looks really good and I can see opportunities for it. I'm going to do some training and learn how to use it. So I signed myself up to do the RKC instructor course, and my wife, much to her disgust once she realized how difficult it was, and we passed that instructor course at the end of 2014. The following year, by then I had branded myself as the Kettlebell Physio. I opened up my physiotherapy practice in 2015, and as you can see from these images, it was very kettlebell focused, and part of what I was delivering there was group exercise classes using kettlebells. You can see from these pictures, this was the practice. I don't know if you can see the cursor, but I'm going to use it anyway. 1, 2, 3 doors at the back all led into clinic rooms, so treatment rooms. But obviously the rest of it is open plan gym floor space. And we had 2 business bylines: changing the face of physiotherapy, which was intended to refer to promoting exercise and population health and encouraging physical activity, which was atypical of a common high street physiotherapy practice, which was very passive treatment focused. And the second one, doing things differently, which was referring to the use of kettlebells. Commonly, when you walk into a physiotherapy practice, you see Pilates reformers and the like. And it was a challenge. It was a challenge for lots of different reasons. People typically don't know anything about kettlebells, or if they do, they don't like them or don't want to give them a go. 10 years ago, I avoided them like the plague because I didn't know how to use them either. When people came into the practice, they just looked confused because it didn't look like a physiotherapy practice. So I tried lots of different things. This image at the bottom is supposed to represent almost like a martial arts grading system. So we had people coming in for regular group classes, and we wanted to encourage them to continue coming and continue getting better. But ultimately that business financially wasn't viable, and I made the decision to close. But during the 2 years, I was very, very conscious that I had this persona as the kettlebell physio, and I was very publicly promoting evidence-based practice, but I didn't have any science and evidence to base my practice on, which made me feel quite uncomfortable rather. Now, when I made the decision to close the practice, the next question was, well, what next? Because this or that had been a long-term plan, and I'd bet my house on this working. I'm interested in learning and science and research, and I thought, well, the next best thing, the next obvious step seems to be I'm going to go back to uni and do some research on this thing that I've been promoting, because anecdotally I've seen lots of things work. So I had a whole heap of questions and decided to then go back to university. This lady Rosette was the person who inspired my research journey. To give you context, I'm 5'8", 9 at a push if I stand up on my toes. That gives you an indication as to how physically tall Rosette is, and large in stature, or small in stature as the case is. And I remember very clearly the day that Rosette walked into the practice because she had tears in her eyes. And she explained to me that she had had both of her knees replaced almost 10 years ago, and at the time had been told by the surgeon that her knees, or the prostheses that she'd been given, would last about 10 years. And in her mind, because that 10-year expiry date was about to tick over, she thought that her knees were literally going to crumble beneath her, and she was petrified of that. So Rosette came into the practice and started training with me one-on-one, and then eventually progressed into group classes. And she was our most enthusiastic, most regular visitor in group classes. And by the time we closed the practice, she had completed nearly 200 classes. These are some of her PBs for a little bit of perspective. She could deadlift 56 kilos, so that's just picking a 56 kilo bell up off the floor. That's lifting it, not carrying it, obviously. If you've ever swung a kettlebell or had a crack at swinging a 40 kilo kettlebell, you'll appreciate how impressive that is. And then she was able to do a Turkish get up with 8. Now, initially, Rosette couldn't get up off the floor unassisted because of her knees. She could, in a way, get up, but she would have to roll herself into all fours and then get up, rather than go from kneeling to standing. She couldn't physically do it, and it took over a year for her to do that. She persisted, she did it, and then eventually I was able to do that with weight. The 6,800 kilos was something that I had programmed for Rosette on her 68th birthday as a bit of a milestone. I had an indication as to how many kilos she was doing in a class, and I programmed that as a target for her to hit, and she hit it. But most importantly, and what really inspired me, was that there were 2 occasions where Rosette had come in to attend a class and described tripping and avoiding a fall on 2 occasions at home, and specifically attributing not hitting the floor or falling over because of the improved physical function and capacity that she'd had because of the kettlebell training. So I then approached Bond University, where I had trained, and said, look, I've got this idea for a PhD. This is what I'd like to do. Now, these next few slides I've taken straight out of my confirmation of candidature, which is a presentation that we give roughly a third of the way through at Bond. It's a big deal. It's the one and only big milestone throughout the whole journey. It's the point at which we have to present what we've done. Typically at that point, students are well underway in terms of a review if they haven't published one already. And we present our plan. It's externally reviewed by an examiner and internal examiners, and they give us the green light to go ahead. So I was proposing that kettlebell training could be safe and effective, led by a physio. That just happened to be me, but this applies to any MSK or allied health practitioner. It doesn't need to be physio. That the exercises could be done independently at home by older adults, because that's what I had been doing. In the practice, if there were exercises and loading programs that I thought might be useful to people, we would physically sell them a kettlebell. I think it's $40 for an 8 kilo bell, and then they could take it home and replicate and practice what we had been doing together in the clinic. And my focus at that point was primarily falls. I subsequently had to can that because I realized that in order to measure a change in falls, I needed people to fall, which would require lots and lots of people, which was just not going to be practical. But I was focusing on sarcopenia as well, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And the pitch, or a part of the pitch, was that kettlebells are comparatively cheap. It's a lot cheaper to buy a kettlebell than it is to buy a barbell and bumper plates. They're easy to carry around, and the exercises are relatively easy to learn. Some people that train with kettlebells might disagree with the part that it's easy to learn, but that's going to be discussed later on. Or I will be discussing. So if somebody, particularly in an older age group, buys a kettlebell, they can use it at home, they can tuck it away, and they can move it around, and it's non-threatening, particularly with the lighter weights which they will be starting with. It's easy to have something at home that you can use, and if you've got it at home, you're more likely to use it and hopefully build up a bit of a habit of training independently. Now, these two pictures are taken from different papers. One is focused on physical activity and the other is on sarcopenia, and they both essentially refer to the same thing. It's this concept of there being a physical threshold beyond which we lose our independence. And so the big picture was that kettlebell training was looking at general physical preparedness and physical conditioning to help people maintain their independence and stay out of hospital, which was another big thing. When older adults, particularly if they've had falls, end up in hospital, it becomes a lot more challenging. So the focus was physical function, their mental health, their physical independence, and their quality of life. So I had lots of components that I wanted to focus on. Now, some of you will be familiar with the concept of sarcopenia. If you're not, it's described as the progressive and generalized loss of muscle mass. And there are different, and function associated with that, there are different reasons why people might lose muscle mass. The focus of this project was not being active and age. Now, if an older adult walks into an allied health practice or wherever it may be, and the clinician or therapist is concerned that the person in front of them might have sarcopenia and be at a higher risk of the effects of sarcopenia, there's a screen called the SARC-F. And the first step is to assess somebody's grip strength, which is just used as a proxy for overall muscle strength. So we test their grip, there's a threshold. If it's above that, great, they don't have sarcopenia, and we move on. If they're below the threshold, then the next step is to send them for further assessment to determine the quantity and quality of muscle mass, which gives us a diagnosis of sarcopenia and an understanding of potentially how significant it is. We determine the extent of that or the severity of that by then looking at measures of physical function and the impact of that loss of muscle mass, which typically isn't going to be limited to just grip strength. Things like leg strength are a primary concern for therapists. I moved away from sarcopenia, and I'll come back to this in a moment, and I may have dodged a bullet because this was published in 2022, just highlighting that SARC-F screen that I just mentioned on the previous slide is not particularly valid, so that was handy. Anyhow, 2018 was spent for me trying to learn as much as I could from what was online. I was given two pieces of information when I started. One was do a systematic review, and the other was get it done as quickly as possible. Now, I had conducted a systematic review as part of my physiotherapy training, but that was almost a decade prior, and I didn't remember much about it, and I really didn't know how to conduct a systematic review, and I felt a little bit lost. So I spent the entire year reading everything that I could that was published online, putting it into Excel and categorizing it and trying to group things together to get a better understanding of what was there. And I subsequently learned that there were more than a dozen types of systematic review. And by chance, I had received an email to attend a systematic review workshop that was being run by the Institute for Evidence-Based Healthcare at Bond. And I turned up and I sat down with one of the tutors and showed her all of the data that I'd collected, tomato, and she said, it looks like you're doing a scoping review. And I said, a what? I'd never heard of a scoping review before, but it turns out there's this thing called a scoping review, and they are specifically intended to map key concepts in an area to identify the types of evidence that exist and highlight gaps in research in areas that haven't already been comprehensively reviewed. Obviously, if you're in healthcare, you'll be familiar with areas that receive a lot of attention. At the moment, pain is incredibly popular and has been for a long time. Things like tendinopathy, resistance training, and so on. Kettlebells were not well researched. So I conducted a scoping review and published this in 2019, early 2019. And for those of you that are familiar with research, you'll recognize this PICO acronym: Population, Intervention, Comparator, and Outcome. So for a scoping review, we have a different acronym, which is PCC. The first is population. So for me, I was writing this with therapists in primary care or allied health, however you want to label them, people like me. I was writing it to inform people like me. The concept was the use or prescription of kettlebells for therapeutic purposes, and the context was evidence-based practice. So I wanted to identify everything that had been published or had been published by or written by somebody that had clinical expertise. So I picked up everything from case reports and opinion pieces all the way up to systematic reviews. There were no meta-analyses. I think there were four systematic reviews, which weren't particularly great, but I intended to pick up everything and then present what I had. That's what I did. Typically, a scoping review doesn't look at quality of studies, but because the population were people like myself that were interested in the quality of the data that they were looking at, I did include that. It probably gives an over-exaggeration of the quality because the majority of them were not very good. Unfortunately, I didn't get to explore that component in much detail, or the level that I wanted, and I'm going to touch on this right at the end of part 2 of this. So the findings were that the data or the studies were largely underpowered. They were typically of low quality with a high risk of bias. So our confidence as a therapist in what had been reported was typically very low, and the effects were generally very small or trivial. None of the studies had been replicated, which is not unusual. So it was quite likely that the true effects of what was being studied were not reflected in the data that had been published. And the strength of recommendation of training programs or doing something for a particular outcome was weak. The majority of the studies also involved healthy college-age participants, which again is not unusual, but that didn't help me looking at an older population, and very, very limited clinical use of kettlebells in the research work. In terms of clinically meaningful effects, we had nothing really to go on, and certainly nothing that had been replicated. Of not concern is the wrong word, but use. And again, it's not unusual for exercise-based studies to not report what's been done particularly well. I don't really want to go off on a tangent on this one because there are different ways of looking at kettlebell training. My hat as a hardstyle kettlebell practitioner has a slightly different perspective to other styles of kettlebells, but ultimately we're reading reports and not really very clear on what was done, or they were using typically one exercise and often the kettlebell swing. So because of that, there's very limited external validity, i.e. it's not replicating how somebody would typically be using a kettlebell in practice, and also typically underdosed. In research work, you have to be generally very limited in what you do and how you do it, or very specific in what you do and how you do it, which doesn't reflect how people use kettlebells in practice, and certainly nothing like how I had been using them in practice, which was what I had seen work and wanted to replicate. And there were times where the reporting was dodgy. Again, that is not particularly unusual. Spin is a big challenge. I posted something very recently on my own page about this, and that's very frustrating because we tend to read or gloss over the details. We as therapists and practitioners don't have the resource to be looking and dissecting everything that's published. It's just not possible. So spin in research is a massive concern. So to summarize, the clinically meaningful effects that had been reported had not been repeated, suboptimal reporting, not replicating or not representing what was being done in practice, and almost nothing to inform what was happening in primary care. There were no studies on healthy older adults, and with such a large range of weight, you can buy a 2 kilo bell and a 92 kilo bell, we have no idea what is or isn't appropriate or is or isn't effective for different groups of people, particularly the older people. Now, there was one paper which, among those that are interested in kettlebell training, has been, I wouldn't even say widely publicized, because I'm assuming most people seeing this may not have heard of this at all, that looked at the effects of hardstyle kettlebell training in older adults, older females with sarcopenia, and the outcomes were very positive. And there was one paper, part of a master's research work, a 12-week intervention of kettlebell training, a little bit longer than the first study, in a population, older population with Parkinson's disease. So they were the only two. So in my confirmation, I presented this paper and highlighted the fact that there was no data around healthy aging, no data looking at promoting exercise in a healthy but inactive older population and community dwelling. So this hadn't been done before, what I was proposing, which makes it novel, and that's what is really required as part of a PhD. And I came into this thinking all I have to do is a randomized control trial. I didn't know at this point what was really involved in conducting a PhD. And my original pitch was
nice and slow. That's it.
To compare a deadlift versus a swing
Dan.
versus a control group. So at my confirmation of candidature, I said I'm going to have 3 groups: a deadlift group, a swing group, and a walking control group, and have a look at these outcomes. And I presented the paper by Chen saying it works in an older population that has sarcopenia. And I presented this paper saying there are no non-responders to resistance exercise in older adults. So I thought I had a watertight plan. And this was the comment that came after I'd presented. I'd spent 40 minutes presenting my pitch, and the external examiner was invited to ask some questions, and he chose not to ask a question but make this statement. And he said, "This project is destined for failure." So that took the wind out of my sails somewhat, to say the least. And ultimately that led on to me shifting the focus and the trial becoming what you're going to see shortly. Now, while all that was happening, I had lots and lots of questions about kettlebells and how they worked, and I wanted to get into the lab, and I had lots of questions about force, and I'm going to touch on this before I go on to the next slides. So one of the clinical scenarios that therapists will often see in an older population is knee arthritis, osteoarthritis. Typically, impact force and large ranges of motion, or knee flexion, bending the knee, tends to be associated with irritating the symptoms or exacerbating the symptoms. Now, if I perform a hardstyle kettlebell swing, there's no impact with the floor and there's a fairly limited range of motion. So I was thinking, I had this hypothesis that there must be a lot of force going through the floor, and I think that's beneficial or potentially beneficial for somebody with a painful osteoarthritic knee. So I had these questions specifically related to force, which was why I wanted to get on a force plate and get some data and see what was happening. So this graph is data from myself. Along the bottom, these are the kettlebell weights from 8 all the way up to 68 kilos. And then up the y-axis is force in hundreds of newtons. So just to highlight, in the middle of the image here is my body weight, which is the blue line, and the orange line is the net force of what was going through the floor. So I've taken my body weight out of the equation and the weight of the bell. Let me just go back a slide, bear with me. No, I can't go back a slide. Anyhow, as you can see, between 8 and 40 kilos, the force through the floor, the net force, doesn't really change all that much. That was a huge eye-opener for me, because if you've swung a 40-kilo bell, it is incredibly challenging, particularly with higher reps, in terms of rating of perceived exertion compared to an 8. It's much, much harder. I assumed that because it felt harder, the force through the floor must track in the same way, as in increase. The rate of force through the floor must increase at the same rate that rate of perceived exertion was, and clearly that wasn't the case. There was a huge difference in the physical demand, as represented by the RPE, compared to the change in force, which was a massive eye-opener. And I had these questions. I had these hypotheses that I was disproving very early on, that fed into questions that I had going into the trial. Things such as volume loading. If I swing a kettlebell 100 times with an 8-kilo bell versus a 100-kilo bell, there's a huge difference in terms of volume. Maybe the volume is more appropriate for an older age group. Maybe I don't need to continue pushing them to swing a heavier bell if force isn't changing all that much. I'm starting to waffle. So I had lots of questions. If it worked for Rosette, could it work for other older adults living in the community that looked like Rosette? Does it reduce falls risk? Ultimately, I couldn't and wouldn't be able to answer that, but I wanted to include measures such as balance, which might then enable me to do more research, or somebody to do more research later down the track after all this was done. I talked about the impact forces. I'd almost answered my own question in the previous data. Is a heavier kettlebell better? It didn't appear to be, but maybe there's more than just, well, there will be other factors other than force that might be relevant to somebody, like time under tension, or what is described in the literature as impulse. There are lots of reasons why somebody might get a positive effect and an adaptation from a heavier bell that isn't related to force through the floor. How does ground reaction force change? Is that going to be different, or how is that going to be different between somebody like myself, as somebody that was proficient, versus a younger group versus an older group, and how might that change over time? And these questions went on and on and on. And I think one of the reasons why I got the feedback that I did at my confirmation was that I had too many questions that I was trying to answer, although that wasn't clear in the feedback that I got. But having lots of questions also turned out to be a good thing. Now this is text from BMC Geriatrics, which was my target journal at the time, saying preference will be given to submissions describing long-term studies, which that's what I was proposing, and those likely to generate a considerable amount of outcome data, which incidentally was the opposite of a comment that I received from one of my thesis examiners, which highlighted a couple of points. One, the difference in perspective from different people or groups, which is always going to be a challenge, particularly a student when you're getting seemingly different information from different places. But secondly, the utility and value for me as a student in having lots of outcome data. My intent with this, I knew the difference between primary and secondary outcomes and some of the challenges of managing that, but one of the things that I really wanted to do was answer as many questions as I could, sufficient to then produce a hypothesis for a subsequent study. I didn't anticipate that at this point this might be the end of my research journey. So I had this philosophy: if it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. And it was more important to me that I did high quality or produced high quality research rather than getting an outcome or a positive outcome related to the kettlebells. Obviously, I had this brand of, or as the kettlebell physio, but I honestly didn't care whether the outcome was no difference between groups, whatever it might be, or no difference as a result of the intervention. I would have been more satisfied having or producing a good piece of work, even if the result was there's no difference. That was far more important to me. I was at that point very well aware, being at the same institution as Paul Glasziou, that there is a huge amount of research waste, and I didn't want to contribute to that by producing research work that was of either low quality or not actually answering or addressing something that was meaningful. And I also at that point was up to my ears in podcasts, consuming as much as I could, not specifically for the PhD, but it was things that were of interest to me, and being a learner, I was consuming as much as I could. And I have to acknowledge PT Inquest and this gentleman who usually smiles, Eric Mader and J.W. Matheson, because without the influence of PT Inquest, my PhD would not have been what it is, and I'm almost certain that I would have struggled to get the two main studies published, because what I'm going to mention in a moment, I didn't learn or wasn't told about as a student. I learned them through a podcast. So the first was pretrial registration. I didn't know at that point that for more than a decade, if I was wanting to publish something in a physiotherapy journal, if it wasn't pre-registered, it wasn't publishable. And also protocols as well. BMC Geriatrics, where I ultimately published the Bell trial and the qualitative study, required that I submit the protocol for peer review, and obviously it needed pre-trial registration. I didn't learn about registered reports, and I won't go into details about that, but I didn't learn about registered reports until it was too late to produce one, which is disappointing. But I also learned about, through this podcast, Everything Hurts, with Dan Quintana and James Heathers, I think both of whom have been interviewed on PT Inquest, about preprints and the open science framework. the preprints enabled me to not only have a DOI and a publication, but be able to get the work out early. So I started releasing the preprints of my publications, and even those that haven't subsequently been peer-reviewed and published in a journal, as preprints a year ago. The qualitative study, which you'll see later on, was published this weekend, so the 3rd of June, but that's been available now for 10 months or so. And in the thesis, it enabled me to cite a very distinct piece of the project or piece of work. The Open Science Framework has been gold for me, and the research data from the Bell trial is publicly available on Open Science, and Coursera as well. Stats is not a strong point for me, and just hearing about resources like Coursera, which is a free course, was hugely valuable. Also, a resource that I was introduced to through the Evidence Centre for Evidence-Based Practice, used to be called CREB at Bond, was this thing called the Equator Network, which provides links to reporting guidelines for all different types of studies. And again, these only came up through me attending this systematic review workshop and being directed to this. Without that, I wouldn't have either known about them or then been prompted to use them in my own studies. And being a bit of a lurker online, I was also very well aware in my little silos and community of other publications like this that were coming out. This a series written by Christian Thornburg and this gentleman Thomas Bandholm, that gave me more direction. One of them was the Consensus on Exercise Reporting template. One of the challenges that I highlighted in the earlier slides was the lack of information that had been published, providing the reader with a good understanding of what had been done in the study in order to then be able to replicate it. So I wanted to, I was aware that these existed, and I wanted to follow them to the letter as best I could, to tick as many boxes to make sure that by the end of it I had a good quality piece of research work. Now again, I don't know where this where I heard about this, but this trial design, a pragmatic controlled trial, was what I ultimately ended up going with. And I really like this statement. One of the signs of a mature profession is its confidence and willingness to scrutinize its own methodology, which is what I really wanted to do. Like I said, I didn't care whether there was no effect from the kettlebell training. It was more important to me that I went through the motions and conducted a good quality study. In this, Marilyn Hansen says we have a duty and a responsibility to use interventions that have been evaluated for efficacy and safety, and that was something that I wasn't able to do whilst I was promoting evidence-based practice at my own practice. I simply had nothing to base that on. And ensure that research is closely linked with clinical practice and impacts how therapists manage their patients and their health challenges. And that's one of the focuses, bearing in mind that this has been published in Physiotherapy Theory and Practice, of making the research as meaningful and useful to the person reading it, i.e. the physiotherapist or the allied health care provider, whoever it might be, that what is being investigated reflects what's actually happening in practice. Because too often as a therapist, you read a publication or you read a piece of evidence or science, and it answers a very discrete question, but typically produces more questions than answers, and often you're left thinking or feeling, so what? How does this apply to me in my practice and what I'm doing? And that's what I found from the scoping review. There was quite a large number of publications, but very, very few of them even remotely reflected what I was doing and how I was using a kettlebell. And again, sharing the results through publication, whether that's a preprint or not. There are four studies that have come out of my PhD that are available as preprints that most likely will never get into a journal. Now, sometimes people poo-poo the idea of a preprint and say, well, it hasn't been peer reviewed, but fundamentally, if you have the capacity to be able to evaluate and critically appraise a piece of work, you can do that yourself. There are preprints available that you can read for the Bell trial and the qualitative study, and all of the changes and amendments and peer review feedback, and you can see what was changed. The Bell trial ultimately was only really cosmetic changes. The description in the qualitative study that you'll see later had more substantial changes in the structure of the discussion, but fundamentally it didn't really change. So preprints are definitely valuable, and as a consumer of research, which healthcare providers should be, you can make your own mind up. So this is what a pragmatic controlled trial is intended to do. It hopes to, or it aims to, assess the effectiveness of an intervention in a clinical setting. Now, in a clinical trial, it might not be possible to do it within the clinical setting, but the aim is to as closely replicate that if you physically can't get into a, for example, physiotherapy practice and conduct the research. And in doing that, it maximizes the external validity, which means it's representative of what's actually happening, and that enables us to generalize the findings to real-world clinical practice because it's been conducted on a real-world clinical scenario and a population, with the hope that the outcomes are going to be used by stakeholders to inform clinical practice and policy and make decisions that influence the provider and the patients directly. So a pragmatic controlled trial asks the question, does this work in normal practice, rather than can it work? So it's a question of effectiveness versus efficacy. A randomized controlled trial typically addresses questions of efficacy, not effectiveness, and that's the internal versus external validity. There is little or no selection of the participants, and hopefully that's very clear in the coming slides. The intervention is applied flexibly, and given the large variation in physical capacity within the Bell trial group, hopefully that is clear, and it was certainly made clear in the protocol. And the outcomes of interest are those of interest to the healthcare providers and the participants, and you'll see where the outcomes were chosen from. They were outcome measures used by physios in clinical practice. And the trial is designed to help people make decisions about implementing whatever it is in their own scenario. And in part 2, I ask a very specific question going into the qualitative study, and I answer that question right at the end. The population, as I just mentioned, was quite diverse. So we had a 20-year age range and quite a broad physical capacity, and you'll see based on the health conditions that they were very representative of the population. There's no need for blinding. There's no blinding in a pragmatic controlled trial, and there's an expectation of detailed reporting, and hopefully that will be made clear as well. So this was the very first paper, first and second paper, based on the laboratory work. So where I wanted to start with was looking at the kettlebell swing, and the reason for that is that the kettlebell swing is the one exercise that most people associate with kettlebell training, and it's also the exercise that have been researched and investigated the most. And within hardstyle training, which is what I had done, there's a very particular way that it's done and lots of suggestions around effect of having performed it a certain way. In a nutshell, practitioners and those promoting kettlebell training believe that the hardstyle swing in particular increases lower limb power, particularly at the hip. So I conducted a force profile of myself as a quote-unquote expert, or somebody that was proficient in performing the swing, and then asked the participants to come into the lab and perform swings with a series of weights. The very first paper included defining how to do, or showing how to do, a swing. One of the challenges with the previous data that was highlighted in the review were the different ways that people or researchers were interpreting how to use a kettlebell. So I wanted to make that clear. This wasn't the first time that it had been done, but it enabled me then to map that against this image, which is what we call a force time curve. So it's the change in force through the floor at different phases of that swing cycle. And it was really interesting and not at all what I expected. I don't want to get too bogged down in these details because I have spoken about it elsewhere, but that was the purpose of that particular paper. This shows the force time curve over 10 consecutive swings using different weights. So A, B, C, and D are the 8, 16, 28, and 68 kilos. So the 8 and 16, you can see that the shape of that force time curve really doesn't change at all. But once I've got up to 28, the gap between this large initial peak and then the second much smaller peak starts to disappear. Those two profiles start to merge together. What defines a hardstyle swing is what we call a period of float and drop, where the person's standing upright, the bell is floating up, so it's only their arms moving, and then the arms and the bell drop down before we then flex at the hips and knees. So it just gave me a better understanding as to what was happening when the weight of the bell increased, and to ask different questions and come up with different hypotheses as to what was happening and how and why and what might happen. So I conducted that assessment of myself, which was just the swings, and then I had the trial participants come into the lab and replicate the same thing. So at this point they'd never picked up a kettlebell. I showed them how to do it quite briefly. We would have spent less than 10 minutes learning how to do a swing and having a quick practice, and then I asked them to step onto the force platform and perform 12 swings and 12 deadlifts, so that I could compare the swing data against my own and compare the force data from a swing against a deadlift, which was a comparable exercise that you might give this individual to do at home. Typically, a lot of older adults are not going to be given a swing to start with, but they might very well be given a deadlift. So here's an action photo of the dead stop start position, the back of the swing and the top of the swing. And as you can see, this is two different individuals. At the bottom here, there's a comparison between the two. In the paper itself, I go into a lot more detail, but you can see here, if I overlay my force time curve, that there is a big difference in what's happening, which was not unexpected. You would expect that somebody that performs a skilled movement, that the force representation of that is going to be different to somebody that has not performed or isn't proficient in performing that skilled movement. A hardstyle swing is supposed to be, or it's a lower limb exercise, and this is where a lot of people unfamiliar with the swing might get confused, because you're holding the weight in your arms and they think that it's an arm exercise. It's a very alien movement. There are no movements that represent that in activities of daily living, and from experience, people really struggle trying to coordinate that initially, and that's what's being shown in these images. This second peak here and the triple peak in the image below are representing or illustrating what happens when somebody lifts through their arms rather than using the dynamic hip movement or ballistic hip movement that is supposed to happen or supposed to occur during a proficient swing. So that was really interesting to see. And then what I did was compare the difference in force between the deadlifts and the swings and different weights and the males and females, and there are a number of these similar graphs in that trial paper. So that was the first two. I also recruited a comparable number of younger people from the university, predominantly students, and collected data from them, but unfortunately due to time constraints I was not able to publish any of that data. I haven't even analyzed it, so I have an idea of what it will look like, somewhere between the novice and the quote-unquote expert, but I don't know, and unfortunately that got chopped. So this is an interesting slide, and I'll explain why. I was at this point very well aware of the necessity to pre-register my trial, so I did that with the ANZ CTR, and it took a little while for it after the submission for it to be registered. But at that point, I was also aware of the necessity of a protocol, and I'd used the protocol that was discussed in the episode of PT Inquest as a template, created my own, and uploaded that to the Open Science Framework, because once it's there, it's public. It's a date stamped record of what's going to be done. I didn't get the support to have the protocol published in the way that I'd hoped, and irrespective of that, I kind of got unstuck with the timing of it. So I uploaded this to the Open Science Framework, and recruitment started on the 23rd, and I submitted to BMC Geriatrics the trial protocol. But just to look at the dates, on the 7th of August 2019 it was submitted, and then on the 9th of August I submitted the protocol, which had been uploaded to Open Science on the 15th of August to BMC. So on the 15th, the protocol was quote unquote published online. It was made available. It can't then be changed, or if I did change it, there's a record of what it did initially look like. The trial was 5 days later registered, officially registered on ANZ CTR, and I think that was a Friday. And then on the Monday, which was the 23rd, I then actively started recruiting. So I didn't start recruiting until after the trial had been registered and after it had been published on Open Science. Now, unfortunately, BMC Geriatrics didn't get back to me until April 2020. So the trial was already well underway, but unfortunately what I had missed was that they, in terms of the dates, study protocol articles will only be considered for publication that have not completed participant recruitment. So not only had I already recruited, but I was well into the trial, and because of that date issue, that was not accepted for publication. 6 months to consider a paper for publication is just not really feasible when you're on a time frame like a PhD, unfortunately. So that was disappointing. But I have, talking about the guidelines and the documents and the tick boxes that I needed to or wanted to tick through the Equator Network. The first was this Spirit checklist. So I submitted a Spirit checklist with the trial protocol. Ultimately, this was the published trial paper from the study. So this was the centerpiece of my PhD, which was the Bell trial, published in BMC Geriatrics early this year, 2022. Disappointingly for me, the Bell trial and the qualitative paper have received a lot less time and attention than all of the peripheral studies, which were interesting but not of great consequence in my mind. So that's kind of been frustrating because this was the centerpiece, but it was nice to have. So now I'm going to focus on the PICO for the study itself. So the population were older adults living in the community that weren't currently meeting physical activity guidelines. Now, we previously used to use the word sedentary, but that's been replaced by insufficiently active. Seems a bit more PC. And this picture is me and my mum. I dragged my mum into the lab and pushed her really hard with the kettlebells and deadlifts as well. So I got the most out of her. But I had initially tried to recruit through my social media pages and very quickly established that that was failing miserably. So I approached the newsroom at Bond and said, hey, look, this is the study that I'm wanting to do. And we got this article published in the local newspaper. And we had 150 odd applicants very, very quickly. And I managed to get the recruitment done in 3 weeks. And without this, the project, I don't know how I would have been able to complete the study. It could have been doomed. So there was a huge chunk of luck in getting the recruitment done. This is the Bond Institute of Health and Sport, where most of the work happened. There's a building on the ground floor, and out the back there's a large high performance training center, which is where we were studying. I ran a series of information sessions to whittle down the 150. Some people I'd spoken to on the phone and either established that they were interesting or potential candidates, or they were already active, or there was something that would rule them out. But there were too many people, so I thought I'm going to run an information session, and that will identify the people that are keen enough to make the trip to Bond, and take it from there. And I had about 40 people come into 3 sessions, from which I picked 32, which almost self-selected themselves, to be honest. If there had been 34, I would have taken them. The reasons, or some of the reasons why the 8 didn't make it were, I remember one was too physically active. One lady had arthritis in her hands and didn't feel that she could control the bells because I gave them a demo. One person turned up on a mobility scooter and fell asleep several times, and he had a long list of health conditions, so he clearly wasn't appropriate. Another lady lived too far away, so those sorts of things, and the 32 pretty much self-selected themselves. This is a group of the older people in the group, so the over 70s. What I wanted to do was run a quick pilot to test, because I didn't know anything about their physical capacity. So before we kicked off the trial in earnest, I invited a group of the older half to come in, and I would run them through what I was planning to do, and to get some feedback on how easy or difficult that was going to be and what changes I might need to make. It was only really a couple of sessions in a week, but it gave me an indication as to which direction I was going to have to take it. And we had a lot of kettlebells. There were 60 odd that were mine, and then I purchased a group of lighter weight bells, 6 and 4 kilo bells, which I didn't have previously. But as you can see, we went up to 80 kilos. Initially, I had bought a 68 kilo bell, thinking that that was going to be enough. But then by the end of week 3, more than half of the group had lifted that, so I went out and bought an 80 kilo bell. As you can see, the average age was close to 70. That's not all of the trial participants. There were a few people that turned up late and missed the photo. 3 people withdrew at the end of the control period for reasons beyond their control. I think one was having surgery, one had a court date, I can't remember what the other one, one was an injury. So as I mentioned earlier, the group were representative of the population. These were not high performing individuals. These were people that weren't physically doing enough exercise or not meeting the recommended physical activity guidelines for older adults. Some people did have a background. So this gentleman in the blue shirt here used to play AFL, but a lot of the people in the group had never been in a gym before or never done any form of resistance exercise. And what this slide is listing is all of the chronic health conditions that were represented by the group. And as you can see, there was a lot going on. And some of these I didn't know about until after the fact, or at the point of interviewing them after, so non-disclosure, such as a 50-year history of back pain. That participant hadn't told me about that, and there was a heavy deadlift session at the end of week 2, and that flared up her back, and she persisted for another 3 weeks beyond that, 4 weeks beyond that. But ultimately she was the one withdrawal from the trial because of the trial. But that wasn't the only thing that was not disclosed. There was a case of osteoporosis I didn't know about, the peripheral neuropathy I didn't know about. There was a cancer that I didn't know about, and there was a large aortic aneurysm that I didn't know about, which is a concern because had I known about it, that person wouldn't have been in the trial. So very representative. The intervention was 45-minute group training sessions. This picture doesn't show it very well, but the training space was not ideal. We were in the gym. We took up a small section of the gym, but it was far from ideal. There were times when there were sports teams, small sports teams. There was a swimming group that would quite often be in there at the same time, and occasionally a football group or a school group. So it was not ideal. But the intervention was a 45-minute group training session on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So I took the 29 people, split them into 2 groups, and ran a 9 till 10 and then a 10 till 11 group session. And then I would give the participants an exercise to do at home on the days in between, so the Tuesday, Thursday, that would last roughly half an hour or so. The intent was that in the gym, the focus would be on intensity. So a focus on technique, but a focus on, once they'd overcome the initial hurdle of their body adjusting and getting used to the weights, ramp up the volume and intensity fairly quickly and fairly consistently, but we had access to heavy weights. The training at home was, they were each given an 8-kilo kettlebell, and I would give them an exercise either with that or with body weight, and the plan was that was to build a habit of training, to build confidence in being able to train independently, and to practice the techniques. So it ticked a lot of boxes. It increased the chronic training load, and psychologically it helped. And then when they came back into the group environment, they were hopefully a little bit better, given a little bit of extra practice. I focused on what's called the big 6. So in hardstyle training, that's a swing, a clean, a press, a squat, a snatch, and Turkish get up. But the focus was on that, but we used an awful lot of other exercise. And the principle was that I was going to push them as hard as I felt I comfortably could. Not necessarily how I would have done it in my own practice, and I didn't do it quite like this in my practice because I had the convenience of being able to say, you can't jump into a group class until you have satisfied a certain level of proficiency and safety and comfort. So what I used to do in my practice was run what I'd call semi-private classes, which was a maximum of 4 people, and they would come in and they would work with me to learn the techniques. Once they'd learnt the techniques and were safe and comfortable and competent performing those techniques, then I would let them go into a group class where we were training together. There was far less instruction on how to do it. It was physically training. Whereas with this group, I didn't know any of the individuals. For almost all of them, I hadn't conducted a pre-training physical screen. I took it from them that if they said that they could do it and they could get up off the ground, they said, yeah, I can do that fine. I didn't test them, but I didn't know what they could or couldn't do. For example, there were 2 people that struggled to get up off the ground without assistance, and one of the exclusion criteria was being able to get up off the floor independently. But that's the nature of the beast, unfortunately. So another couple of these guideline documents, the Bell trial, there's a tidier checklist that I completed, and there is a consensus on exercise reporting template that is completed, uploaded with the Bell trial. And on these next few slides, this is the program schedule. So I uploaded everything that I have done on, or we did on every single day, with links to videos, either videos that I've provided them or videos that I've given them to support the training that we're doing. So that takes you through week 1, week 2, 3, and I'll just scroll through each of these, and I'll just highlight here. So this is available. If you want to look at it, you can. If there's a hyperlink there, it will take you to a video. And at the bottom of this list, we will get to a series of like appendices type items. Now, by this point, we were not in the gym because of COVID, and I'll come on to that. And that's why there are more hyperlinks to videos than there were at the beginning. So all of these additional references are links to online resources, typically videos and explanations given by other people that the trial participants could look at and learn. So this video is showing one particular session where, this will stop in a moment, the participants were training together in pairs. So you can see this gentleman here has got a clipboard. He's working with this gentleman here, and it was a you go, I go. I experimented with all sorts of different approaches. There were some, and you might recall from the images earlier, where I was standing at the front of the class performing the exercise, and they were effectively copying me, and we were all doing it together. There were other times, and this worked quite well based on the feedback, where I would set out what I was going, or what I wanted them to do. So there's a board here in the background that has the training session written out on it. They would take a clipboard with the exercises. I wouldn't set the weight for them. I would let them pick what weight they felt most comfortable with, and then they would, with their partner, take it in turns to perform the exercises, and then keep a record of what weight, how many sets and how many reps they had performed on each. And then at the end of the session, I would then collect that data and then put it into an Excel spreadsheet to keep a track of training load. When we got to the halfway point, I then had to use SurveyMonkey to collect that same data, which became a bit more troublesome. So I'm going to show you each of these and run through them. It kind of feels a little bit awkward for me looking at these because it feels time consuming, but this is probably what's going to be of most interest to the people watching this video. So this is an example of a home training. So this would be a Tuesday or Thursday home exercise. This one had 4 different levels based on their capacity. So the first one was a split squat with support. So that's them holding onto a chair. Hopefully this loads in a moment. Holding onto a chair or kitchen worktop or whatever it might be, and then they perform the exercise. Here we go. Hopefully it's not too small. So in this video I've got a dowel that could be a broom that shows them the vertical motion. So I've got the broom against the front of my leg. I've lifted my front foot off the ground to illustrate that the body weight should be in the middle. So the second one, the progression, is to do that weighted split squat. Sorry, do a weighted split squat. Same thing, with or without support, depending on how comfortable they are, physically holding the bell in a rack position. So each of the videos, you can see I'm lifting my hand off there to show them that they don't have to hold on. I would typically do the videos face on and then side on so that they could see. These videos were shot in the biomechanics lab. So this one's a reverse lunge in a rack. The support is gone. Which is a little bit more challenging. And ideally taking a step back that's far enough so that their trunk is in the middle between their feet. And then the final one, this is level 4, if they felt comfortable, was a split squat holding the weight overhead. There would have been, or there were, some females in the group that would have found holding the 8 overhead like this very difficult. And certainly pressing the weight overhead for some in the early stages was impossible. In my training session this morning, one of the ladies was pressing a 12 kilo bell for reps. Bear with me 1 second. So now this is an example of a couple of different videos. The first one in one video shows 8 different options for a Tuesday-Thursday exercise. The 2 videos below it, the easy and challenging, are 2 training day videos. So I'll let the first one run and I'll talk you through what's happening. So we've got a loaded step up. This is a single suitcase. So just holding the bell by our side and stepping up, stepping down. Next one is 2. By this point they had 3 bells at home, typically not the same weight. Next option is a single rack. So we're still doing the same step ups. This is a leg exercise. We're just making it more challenging with the weight. Next option is two bells, so a double rack. Single overhead. It's obviously harder to hold the bell overhead than in the rack position. Double overhead. And then an asymmetrical option, so one in the rack and one by the side. One overhead and one down by the side. So what I would do is send them a link to the video that I had recorded with a long description and give them that to do. And the guidelines for the home exercise were quite broad. I would give them typically just one exercise and set an easy achievable minimum but no ceiling. And I think it was that particular exercise where one of the women had come in the next morning into the class, and what I would do is then collect feedback as to whether they had done the home training from the day before or not, and then tick them off. At that point I wasn't collecting the training data in the gym, just recording what we were doing in the training sessions. But she came in and said she'd done 400 of those which blew my mind, because she wasn't somebody that had any gym experience or resistance training experience at all. So this next one, this is a training session. So this is after COVID had struck. This was me recording what we call a kettlebell complex, which is a series of kettlebell exercises, one after another, strung together. And this was the easy option. So complex option 1 without a snatch, row, swing, a high pull, clean to the rack position, squat, and then down to the ground and switch. So what would happen then is that they would do that, and then on the second round they would do 2 reps, and then on the third round they would do 3 reps of each, and so on until they wanted to stop. And we did something almost identical to this morning. It was a swing, a clean, squat, press, and we did this up to 5 reps of each just this morning. I'm going to pause that one, I think. Yep, I'll pause that one and go on to the next one. So this is more difficult, and I gave them the option of choosing either 7 techniques or 9 techniques. I think it'll be the snatch that's missing because that's a harder exercise to do. So I gave them options, I showed them what to do, and then let them decide how difficult they wanted to make it. So an offset foot position, a deadlift and a row, a double clean, a kickstand swing times 5. So when I said double clean, it wasn't a double clean. There's a clean, a lunge forward, lunge backwards, squat, press, snatch, and that's one of the harder exercises to do. Switch sides and repeat. So those, as you can imagine, are quite difficult, not only to physically perform, but it also mentally is quite challenging as well. I know those that work with older adults will talk about dual tasks. So performing the exercise and thinking about what you're doing and the order of them is more challenging. So that's an example of a more challenging complex, and they would have had different weights at home. Everybody had an 8. For a lot of people, an 8 would have been far too easy, and hopefully they had a more suitable weight. It's very challenging with the kettlebells because a bell that is easy to do a deadlift with is, a bell that is easy to do a deadlift with might be quite challenging to do a snatch with, and vice versa. So you need access to different weight bells ideally. So what I'd done at the outset as a way of communicating with everybody, I had emails from everyone at the point of recruitment, but what I wanted to do was create more of a community where we could all talk together and share videos and share experiences and be there to support one another and encourage one another and talk about the training and create this community environment. So I set up a private group on Facebook, and most of the people, I think there were 8 in the group of 29 that didn't have a Facebook account or didn't want a Facebook account. So for those people, I was only able to communicate with them via email for the latter half of the trial. But for everybody else, they were very active in the Facebook group. So I would be in communication with them daily, one way or another, either giving updates or giving links to other accounts where they could learn about kettlebell training or see other ways of doing things. And then later on, once COVID hit, I was having to then use YouTube as well. So everybody had access to YouTube because everyone had internet access. So that was what was happening intervention wise. 2 pictures were sent from, this was a gentleman training at home with quite a significant health concern, but incredibly well motivated, and he zip tied a dumbbell to his 22 kilo bell, and this lady had tied with ribbon a 10 kilo plate to the bottom of her 18 kilo bell because 18 kilos wasn't heavy enough for her deadlifts. So they were a very motivated group of people that were enjoying training at home and enjoying the intervention. It was really good to see that kind of feedback. That brings us to the end of part 1. I'll see you in part 2.